Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this What Economists Really Do for International Women's Day. My name's Abi Adams-Prassl. I'm a professor in the economics department at Oxford, an associate head of department with a kind of responsibility for research impact and engagement. And so today what I wanted to talk to you about was it's going to be slightly different to some of the ones of these that we've run in the past. I want to go into a little bit more detail on a project that I'm currently working with Christina Hudden, who's at Aalto University in Finland, Emily Nix, who's at the University of Southern California in the US, and Ning Jiang, who is based also in the economics department at Oxford. And so together, what we have is a series of projects kind of around the theme of the economics, if you like, of violence against women. Now, this agenda, so that this is kind of being funded by a grant that I have from the European Research Council. And the kind of broader motivation for starting this work was a couple of years ago, I was doing some policy work, both as a specialist advisor to the Women and Equalities Select Committee for UK Parliament. And I was also doing some work with charities in the UK who are very concerned with how the police and prosecutors have been dealing with violence against women and girls in the context of the UK. And as we were kind of, as I was kind of doing some of that work and also exploring some of the economics literature in this area, there were kind of two things that really stood out. So first is just actually in a number of contexts, like the hard evidence and data that we have on the prevalence and the impacts of these types of events has historically been exceptionally poor. And the second thing is, this is not so relevant for this paper, but for some of the work that, as I said, this kind of team that we have together on domestic violence, some of the ways that traditionally economists have conceptualized some of these issues actually were missing some of the key dynamics that practitioners and stakeholders and policy people who were dealing with these issues on the ground, some of the economics literature just didn't seem to be capturing some of, if you like, the kind of first order things that these people were saying. So that's the kind of broader motivation for this agenda. And as I say, I'm going to be going into detail on one project that we have, which is specifically around violence in the workplace and some of the gendered aspects to this phenomenon. Now, over the last 5 years, the Me Too movement has made it really salient that violence at work and the gendered aspects of violence at work is not a niche issue, but one that affects many women globally. So in terms of, anyway, so I was watching this film, She Said, last week, and just kind of my jaw was dropping at like how some of the themes that they were talking about, in the context of a Hollywood movie this is about Harvey Weinstein and the New York Times reporters who kind of started to kind of expose some of the Weinstein abuse. Some of the themes that were coming out in that film, if you like, you're going to see, if you like, in a slightly more kind of academic context later in this talk. And so the motivation for studying this kind of comes, if you like, from that movement, but trying to understand a little bit more, are those themes that were kind of popularized in the media in terms of some of the power dynamics at play, in terms of that were characterizing violence at work, but also some of the asymmetry and the consequences between perpetrators and victims when it comes to violence at work. What we were trying to do in this project is understand to what extent those actually do play out, if you like, in representative data on this phenomenon at large. So just to give you again a little bit more of a flavor as to what it was that was kind of being characterized in these media accounts. So this is Rowena Chu, who was one of the kind of key women who was kind of coming forward in the Harvey Weinstein case. And what she talks about in this quote is, she notes this power asymmetry, that she was the lowest person on the totem pole, that the assistants are kind of these unseen forces that, they're propping up a lot of the work that's happening, but themselves have very little power. And, if you think about what happened to her, it was her who left the firm, who left the industry after the assault with Harvey Weinstein, whereas it took a number of years, if you like, for there to be any labour market consequences and any retribution, if you like, for Harvey Weinstein. Now, it's not just, if you like, the rich and powerful that came forward during the kind of the early bits of the Me Too movement. This is another account that was told to the Huffington Post, if you like, kind of, a more kind of everyday scenario. So here we have the quote that, from a survivor, that they worked at Starbucks for 3 years during college. And when one of my co-workers and I reported our shift manager for sexual harassment, we were told that we would be laid off the following week. So not the manager, but rather the people who were reporting these issues. So as I say, kind of part of this, kind of one of the motivations in this paper is to understand, okay, well, if we actually have data on as much as we, on as representative or, as big a set of cases as we can, do these sorts of events, do these sort of phenomena still come out? So that's, if you like, the kind of media background. There is a small amount of academic background in this area as well, and some kind of some of the data that we have, that at an aggregate level. So the data that we do currently have before this paper would suggest that, actually it is true that violence in the workplace is sadly common. So in the US, we have accounts of about 2 million assaults at work annually through the National Crime Victimization Survey. And the data that we have and some of the academic research that we have in this area already would again kind of corroborate this idea that there is often a gendered aspect to violence in the workplace. So if we take the US case again, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where they record information on assaults occurring in the workplace, whilst almost 100% of the perpetrators would identify as male, 68% of the victims would identify as female. Now, one paper, because of the nature of this talk, I'm not going to do a big kind of academic literature review, but one of a key paper that came out last year in the economics literature, which was specifically on sexual harassment. So this is by Ola Folker and Johanna Rickner in Stockholm, and that came out in the QJE last year. They were looking using Swedish data at the prevalence and kind of dynamics, if you like, around sexual harassment in the workplace, but their measure of sexual harassment is going to be slightly, it's going to be different to what I'm going to be looking at. So they would be kind of capturing as well, like workplace bullying, negative comments. So for example, saying to a male nurse that, he shouldn't be in that position because he's a man, that would get counted in that paper as sexual harassment, which I'm not saying it shouldn't, but I'm going to be looking specifically at kind of violence and assaults. And anyway, in this paper, what they show using this match between victimization survey data and then their wider kind of administrative data and tax records, so they can know a lot more about what's going on in these firms. What they show is that for both men and for women, if you're in the gender minority in the workplace, the likelihood of being exposed to sexual harassment is much greater, and indeed that has consequences for the turnover rates, like how quickly these gender minorities will leave the firm. And so given that, in a number of workplaces, women disproportionately are in the gender minority, you might expect this existing evidence to kind of show that they are, potentially more exposed to sexual harassment at work. So what we do in this research is really to harness pretty unique data that allows us to actually characterize as best as we can the dynamics of violence in the workplace in Finland, so in a specific context that's Finland. And so using every police report in Finland that we're able to match then to their wider kind of data on employment, on earnings, not just for them, but also for the wider workforce, we're kind of exploring a series of different questions here. So the first set of questions that we're asking is actually what are the labour market consequences of violence at work, both for victims and for the perpetrator? And indeed, to what extent does economic inequality between victims and perpetrators and kind of wider power dynamics affect these labour market outcomes? So this is going to allow us to, if you like, look at, but using the data, look at from an empirical perspective, some like to what extent some of those some of the themes that were coming out of those accounts in Me Too that I touched upon earlier, are these actually borne out if we look at, if you like, the universe of police reports. Now, we might expect that these events do not just have consequences for victims and perpetrators. They might also be spillover effects on other employees at the firm currently, but also it could affect how firms decide to hire in the future, given, you know, if these events have occurred. So we're able to look at that because we also understand all the outcomes of everyone else who is employed in these workplaces. And we're going to then start looking at to what extent does management and actually the gender composition of management accentuate or mediate some of these wider factors. I should say at this point that, sorry, I should have said at the beginning that people should just put any questions in the chat and the Q&A as we go through, and I will kind of try and collect them at different points as I go through the talk, but we'll probably take most questions at the end. Okay, so there is a literature already kind of on sexual harassment within economics. Wanted to note this in terms of, because this is like about a What Economists Really Do series, so you might think that this isn't, you know, so there is a small literature, a growing literature on this. There's the Folke-Rickner paper that I've already mentioned. There's a couple of new papers specifically looking at Me Too and also how the reporting of sexual harassment responds to kind of wider business cycle dynamics. And so what we're really doing differently here is we're looking both at realized events and often serious events. These are mainly assaults. But what we're kind of the unique thing that what we're able to do in this paper is because we observe both victims and we can link it to perpetrators, we can actually look for the same events at what happens to both parties, and that hasn't been able to be done before. We also then link into this broader literature about like actually how do firms work and what makes a good workplace and what makes a, you know, what affects, if you like, employment outcomes in the firm, both in terms of the role of management and also in terms of the composition and dynamics of peers in the workplace. Okay, so in terms of our roadmap for I guess like the next, I don't know, like 25-30 minutes, I'm going to tell you a bit more about the data and then go into the individual impacts on victims and perpetrators, and then tell you about the firm impacts and the role of management, and kind of end with a couple more discussion points about, you know, so what does this mean more broadly for how we might think about both the reporting of these types of events, but also what potentially could we be doing differently, or what more research is needed. Okay, so in terms of the data, so what we're using here is the universe of police reports that were filed in Finland since 2006. So what does this mean? So in Finland, it's a bit different to those of you who are in the UK. Your equivalent, I guess, of a national security number follows you around in a number of different kind of parts of society, and we're able to match together these different records that are being collected through different state institutions using that ID. And so a police report here, you should think about it as like the first step in a police investigation. It's where you've turned up at a police station or you've filed a kind of a complaint online, and that is what then kickstarts. Okay, we need to understand to what extent, you know, is there evidence? Like, what's the kind of evidence that exists for this claim? So it's like, yeah, you should think about it as along with, especially with violence against women claims, for a number of reasons. We often have a lot of attrition between, if you like, first report and ever getting to court, which have reasons nothing to do with necessarily how valid or the quality of the claim. You just see a lot of attrition. So what we're able to do is we're able to take every police report in Finland since 2006 and match it to different data on tax records and employment, on demographics, so that we can including, you know, which firms these colleagues are going to be employed at, giving us a really rich picture of what's going on before and after an assault at work. And so here we're going to be defining violence between colleagues as where we have a police report and both the victim and the perpetrator worked in the same firm. So just quickly, in terms of the interpretation of this, so of course, there are many incidents of violence that do not end up in a police report. So underreporting is the norm generally when it comes to crime. So victimization surveys would suggest that about 10% of physical assaults, kind of in general, get reported to the police. And so those are the ones that do get there are typically the most serious crimes. So I'm not actually going to be talking to you today about what the prevalence of workplace violence is, and you know what I'm going to, because I've got an underreport here, and it's going to be true that what I'm going to be showing you are the dynamics that are occurring for the most serious types of incidents. You might be worried because I'm going to be comparing male on female crime with male on male crime, and you know, we might there are, as I'm going to be very clear about, there are a number of different dynamics going on there. But one thing that we don't see, at least in the victimization surveys that we have access to, any hard evidence on, is whether we would expect significant gender differences in reporting rates. If anything, some of our results are going to suggest that women are, you know, the assaults that women are kind of experiencing are on average more serious than those for male victims, which with some kind of threshold reporting model would suggest that women are even less likely to report than men. But that's something that we can't say anything specific, kind of hard on from the evidence. Okay, so what are the crimes here that we're going to be dealing with? So here what we've got is, so this is the characteristics of the police reports in our data, both in terms of all of the assaults, all of the crimes that we have access to, where we can observe that the victim and the perpetrator were in the same firm. And then I've split them according to the kind of the gender composition of the perpetrators and the victims, i.e. do you have a male perpetrator and a female victim, or a male perpetrator and a male victim? Now you'll notice here that there are no female perpetrators in the data as I've kind of selected it. So why is that? So in our full data set, in terms of the police reports in general, we do have a small share of these events are occurring where you have a female perpetrator and either a female victim or a male victim. Now, the problem that we face in terms of understanding, if you like, female violence against men and female violence against women as well, is that a lot of the time, especially for female, where you have a female perpetrator and a male victim, at the same time, you also have a police report where the male victim becomes the perpetrator and the female perpetrator is recorded as the victim. So these kinds of where you have female perpetrators and male victims, at least in what gets reported to the police, it looks like there are punches going both ways. And given that, what is kind of tricky to kind of think about who's the perpetrator, who's the victim. So here what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be focusing on male perpetrators and like kind of throughout this talk, because we don't have that many female perpetrators to start with, and the kind of dynamics seem a bit complicated. So what you can see here is that most of these events are assaults. The next most common crime category is a petty assault, which is lesser category of assault. Petty assault here would include groping over the time period that we're looking at. Now, one of the things I think is quite interesting here is if we look at, whilst assault and petty assault make up the majority of these events, we also have kind of these two other crime categories. Menace and negligent injury. Now, what you can see is that for male on female violence, menace is the third most important category, whilst for male violence, we have that negligent injury is the third most prevalent. Oh, actually, sorry, it's actually the second most prevalent, sorry. Now, this is kind of interesting because menace is a much more serious type of violent incident in terms of, if you look at the proportion of perpetrators who end up in prison if they get to a court case, the negligent bodily injury. So menace is where you're directly causing another individual to have like severe kind of fear for their life or kind of bodily integrity. And I think it also includes kind of stalking. Negligent injury, well, negligent, I guess here is the word. There's less of a kind of direct intent, okay? So this would be kind of someone being an idiot and messing around, okay? But nonetheless causing injury to another person. So again, quite different in terms of what we can already see in terms of the types of crimes that characterize male-female and male-male violence. Okay, there's a lot of numbers here, don't get stressed. I'm going to pick out the cool ones. So this is just telling you a little bit more about what are the characteristics of perpetrators and victims, again, by male-male and male-female crimes. So the key thing that I'd like you to kind of focus on here is if we think about the share of people who have positive earnings. Okay, so this is and so here, why wouldn't it be, if it's workplace violence, that everyone is either employed or has positive earnings at the point at which these assaults are occurring? It's a slight nuance in how we at this point in the paper at least had defined our sample, because employment is captured at year end. What we wanted to do is make sure that if an event occurred, say in January, and then someone got fired because, they would be characterized as unemployed in December, which is the point at which our year-end employment gets measured. So that's why there's a slight difference here. But anyway, the key thing that I want you to kind of look at is what the difference is between the amount that perpetrators and victims are earning for male and male versus male-female crimes. So what we can see is there's a much greater gap in earnings for where you have a male perpetrator and a female victim compared to a male perpetrator and a male victim. What we also have is a much bigger gap in age and also in the share if you like who are in management. So again, with male-female violence, we have that there are larger age gaps, i.e. the perpetrators are on average older than the victims and are much more likely to be managers than victims. So what we have here is also kind of differences characterizing the economic inequality between perpetrators and victims across male-male versus male-female crime. I should also say that there's like loads more descriptives and stuff in the paper, which is in our working paper series, but in the interest of time, I'm actually now going to move on and actually start telling you a little bit more about some of the impacts that we find following these events. Now, because of our data, what I'm able to do is look at how does employment change for victims and for perpetrators before and after these events. Now, as economists, like in kind of the empirical work we do, we often try to be very, very careful about causal claims. So what does this mean? So to what extent am I able to say that if I see a fall in employment or a fall in earnings after a police report for workplace violence, how confident can I be that fall or that change in labor market outcome is caused by the violence? So that's what the kind of their so-called identification concern here is. Why might this be difficult in this context? Well, we might think that, well, firstly, people separate from their jobs, naturally, even if there's not any workplace violence. We might think that, given what I've shown you just now, is that perpetrators and victims systematically seem to be, especially for male-female violence, seem to be occupying different hierarchies in the firm. Maybe they would have different turnover rates and different propensities to be unemployed 4 or 5 years out, even if there was no workplace violence incident. So that's one kind of set of concerns. The other set of concerns is that, well, perhaps actually someone decides to lash out at their colleague because they knew they were going to get fired, or they knew that they were doing badly at work. And so perhaps that person could have been doing badly at work and faced some kind of employment loss, even if they hadn't turned around and assaulted their colleague. Okay, so that's a kind of, and for victims, similarly, perhaps a victim could indeed be victimized because they were identified as someone who might be leaving the firm, or someone who was already kind of vulnerable and having a kind of a bad kind of like economic shock. Okay, so those are the types of concerns that we would have about tying, or about making a causal claim about changes in how labour market outcomes kind of evolve over following workplace violence, and then tying that back to the incident itself. Now, to mitigate these concerns, I'm not going to go into detail with this because, this is, a kind of relatively relaxed talk. But because we've got such rich data here, what we're able to do is to employ something called a match difference and difference design. And we also include something called an individual fixed effect, i.e. we're able to compare outcomes within the same individual. And then what we do is we find, if you like, the person in Finland who looks most identical to the person who is either the perpetrator or the victim of workplace violence. And we compare what happens to our victim and our perpetrator to, if you like, their doppelganger in the wider Finnish workforce. Okay, and so we're going to be using the change in the evolution of our perpetrators' outcomes and our victims' outcomes to their doppelganger, to their matched control, who looks identical in terms of their labour market outcomes and demographics and the types of firms that they're employed in. They look identical all the way up until the point of the violence, and it's only after, and then we say, well, after that, how do their kind of trajectories differ? Yeah, happy to take questions on that. Okay, so again, short talk, so I'm going straight into the kind of one of the main results, which is so this here is showing you what the employment effects, so what is the employment impact of workplace violence for victims and for perpetrators, for male-female crime and for male-male crime. So if we take actually, I'm going to take the male-male crime first. So if you look here on the right-hand side panel of this figure, so you've got the blue bar, which shows you following, in the 5 years following an assault, what are this incident of workplace violence, what was the impact for victims in terms of the change in their employment rates. And the red bar gives you what was the change in the employment rate for perpetrators relative to their doppelganger, relative to their matched control. So what we can see here is perhaps might you what have expected. So both victims and perpetrators suffer negative labour market outcomes following these events, but those consequences are much greater for perpetrators than for victims. So the separation rate for perpetrators is much higher than victims. Now, if you now turn your attention to the left-hand panel, this is showing you what is going on for male-female crime. Now here you can see that things look a little bit different. So firstly, if you like, the point estimate for perpetrators is actually smaller than for victims. So on average, perpetrators are losing less than in terms of their labour market outcomes than their female victims. Although on a statistical basis, basically we can't, it looks like both victims and perpetrators are perhaps losing out to the same, to a similar, or like not so different extent. Okay. Now here, what we can also do is we can compare across these types of male-female versus male-male crimes. And we can, and really what the kind of key, if you like, surprising thing here is that male perpetrators who commit workplace violence against a female colleague, they just don't seem to be having as large of a negative employment consequence as what we might have expected. This is true if we look at earnings. So here, this just shows you similarly, but for the percentage change in earnings. If anything, I think these earnings results are potentially even more stark. What we can also do is, so what I've done in terms of constructing that figure is taken my victims, taken my perpetrators, and find their most similar person in Finland who at time 0 was not subject, was not assaulted, was not assaulted by a colleague. What we might also be interested in is comparing, well, okay, so how is workplace violence any different to if you're, assaulted but not by a colleague, okay? So what we're also able to do is compare victims' outcomes to victims of similar crimes who look similar, again, in the 5 years leading up to an assault, but one person is assaulted by a colleague and another person is assaulted but by someone who's not in the same workplace as them, and similarly for perpetrators. And so here what we find, and here what I just want you to focus on is the left-hand figure, the positive coefficient, the positive kind of red, the positive red bar, and the fact that the confidence intervals, that kind of gives us a measure of how statistically confident we are in a particular result. What I want you to notice is this positive red bar, okay, where the confidence interval doesn't overlap with 0. So what this is what this kind of figure shows you is that in the case of male-female colleague violence, perpetrators seem to be doing better than otherwise identical people who go on and assault someone, but they're not their colleague. Okay, so again, what this graph is here to show you is it's kind of underlying what I was saying on the last slide, that with male-female violence, what seems, if you like, puzzling in terms of the labour market consequences following assaults is that male perpetrators don't seem to be losing their jobs or suffering as large a fall in earnings as we would expect, given this non-colleague violence, counterfactual, but also if we compare male to female perpetrator outcomes, if you like, to male-male perpetrator outcomes. So that this seems to be one of the key anomalies. And, it's not statistically significant, but again, we have some suggested evidence that perhaps female victims might be doing a bit worse than we would have expected. So, and then we kind of try and explore in the paper a little bit more about why this might be the case. And again, really honing in on this role of economic inequality within the firm. So this figure here is just to show you kind of what I was pointing out in the descriptive, in that kind of table of all of the statistics on the characteristics of the perpetrators and the victims. But what it's here to show you is the blue bar and the red bar. So these are showing you that perpetrators of workplace violence against women compared to perpetrators of workplace violence against men are much more likely to be managers, they're much more likely to be high earners within the firm, and the negative green bar is showing you that they're much less likely to be in the bottom 20% of earners in the firm. And so given this, some of those dynamics in terms of male perpetrators against women just not losing their jobs as much, well, maybe that's just because systematically they're kind of occupying these higher rungs within organizations than male perpetrators. So what we find, again, for those of you who don't look at regression tables, just listen to what I'm saying and don't worry too much about what's on the slide. So what this kind of results table shows you is that it is true that when you have perpetrators who are managers and you have bigger income gaps between perpetrators and victims are losing out more in terms of their labour market outcomes, and perpetrators are losing out less. Now, one of the really interesting things, again, that we explore in the paper a little bit more, is that that's true for male-male violence and male-female violence. So, basically, if you're a manager, if you occupy a high occupational rung within the firm, actually, you're going to be, even if you assault a colleague, that's kind of mediates, it kind of protects you somewhat in terms of your labour market outcomes. Even if we actually end up including and like trying to control for those differences as much as possible, however, it is still the case that there is something systematically different going on by the gender of the victim. So to the best of our abilities, when we've controlled for all of these different sources of power asymmetries that we can measure, at least in the data that we have, that, if you like, reduces this kind of stark difference between the treatment of male perpetrators across with female victims versus male victims, but it doesn't get rid of it entirely. So basically, by the end of this section, we're left with economic inequality is important here, and it's important for explaining that asymmetry result, but it's not the end of the story. There still seems to be something systematically different going on for female, in the case of male-female crimes compared to male-male. So what consequence does all of this have for the broader firm, for other people who are employed at the firm, and for potentially for future employees? Now here we're going to be using a kind of a similar design, in that we're going to be looking for firms which look very similar to firms where workplace violence occurs, but there is actually no assault, which we observe in our data. And when we've looked at these kind of firm impacts, the first thing we looked at was, okay, was there any consequence for the size of the firm, for average earnings at the firm, overall turnover, all these things. Now, we basically didn't find a huge amount in all of those things around size, average earnings, and for a subset of firms, we also observe things like profit and revenue. Don't see that much about what's going on. But what we do find, oh, sorry, I thought I'd fix this. What we do find, sorry, this was supposed to be a better graph than this, is that there is a significant impact on the share of women in the workplace as a whole, okay? And this is true even if we exclude the victim and the perpetrator from our sample. So what does this mean? This means that following these assaults, where you've got a male perpetrator and a female victim, these workplaces become significantly more male. And this is not being driven by the victim leaving. So it's going to be driven by either other women leaving the firm, and or women being less likely to be hired into these firms in the future. Now, this is not just a consequence of maybe women not liking being employed around someone who assaults women more broadly. So here what we're able to kind of do is look at, okay, so in workplaces where you have a perpetrator, but he attacks someone who's a woman and who's not a colleague, we don't see there's any systematic difference or spillover effect in terms of the gender composition of the wider workforce. This is something specific that is occurring to workplace violence with male-female crimes. And you don't get anything when it comes to male-male crimes in terms of that gender composition. Now, as I said, there are kind of two margins that could be driving this female share result: more women leaving the firm and fewer women being hired. Now, what we can see is that both of those margins are active. So the positive green bar, this is significant at the so-called 10% level, but not the 5% level, but you can see it's actually quite a large effect. Here, what we can see is that the female share of turnover is systematically higher. Sorry, I'm just checking how much time I have. Is systematically higher, so we have more women leaving the firm. The fact that we have this negative red bar is showing you that it's also the case that a smaller proportion of women are getting hired into new positions that are getting created. Okay, now whilst it's pretty, I would say, easy to interpret what might be going on with the turnover results, i.e. other women not wanting to stay in a firm where not necessarily the perpetrator is being fired. The hiring thing could be driven by women not being as likely to want to join the firm, so the firm faces systematically fewer applications from women if women find out that this has happened at this particular place, Or it could be that from the same applicant pool, firms are less likely to hire women from that applicant pool. Now, we don't observe applications in the data that we have. We observe a lot, but there's always something that you don't observe. But we have some kind of suggestive stuff which would at least suggest that amongst the group of individuals who would be most likely to see change their application behavior in response to something like this, we don't actually see much action that would suggest that they're systematically trying to avoid firms where workplace violence occurs. So as I say, suggestive evidence that actually at least some portion of this hiring result is being driven by firms being less likely to hire women following workplace violence assaults between a male perpetrator and a female victim. So the final just like couple of minutes, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about managers, okay? Because in a sense, it's a pretty depressing paper in general, I'm not gonna lie. But we might want to think about, so are there any firms which seem to be doing something different? So the motivation here for studying managers is there is this kind of growing and large empirical management literature within economics showing that, the gender composition and the broader composition of management can have a really meaningful effect on the behavior and governance within firms. And so there is, I think, I'll just pick out this Egan et al. Paper in the Journal of Political Economy recently. So what they're finding is that they're looking at basically white-collar financial crimes and showing that following people doing bad stuff within financial firms, women are much more likely to get punished for that than like for any misdemeanor than men. And although that's not the case if you've got kind of gender, if you've got kind of a kind of female managers, okay? So what we first look at is, does the gender composition of management affect those victim perpetrator results that we started with? Again, for those of you who don't don't want to look at a regression table, just try and listen to me. So the kind of key takeaway from this table is that the gender composition of management doesn't affect what happens to victims for either male-female crimes or male-male crimes. This is if we look at column 1 and column 3, what that is telling us is that basically female management doesn't affect what happens to victims in any statistically significant way. However, it does affect what happens to perpetrators. So, for both female victims and male victims, as in, across the male-female crimes, female perpetrators are more likely to lose their job if you've got a more if you've got a higher proportion of women in the kind of management tiers of your firm. So it looks like the consequences for perpetrators, regardless of who they're assaulting, is just worse if you've got female managers, more female managers in place. Now, what we might think is that could then have an impact on this kind of wider workforce point about, does this help to, if you like, stem the flow of other women leaving the firm and potentially not cause as much deviation in firm hiring practices? And the answer is yes. So what we find is that this result that we have, that the gender share, like the gender composition of firms with workplace violence, it comes systematically more male following these assaults. This is only true in male managed firms. In female managed firms, we actually don't see any significant change in the wider gender composition of the workforce. Whereas in male managed firms, this is where we're seeing actually that basically the full effect of that we had at the aggregate level is being driven by what's happened in male managed firms. Now in the paper, we get into more detail about, okay, here it's really female managers firing perpetrators that is important thing changing the dial here. So, you know, female managers are more likely to kind of, well, perpetrators are more likely to be unemployed with female managers, and this then is stemming the kind of the wider kind of impacts on the firm. Okay, so in the last 3 minutes before kind of take any questions, just in summary, so in this paper, what we did was we kind of used this unique Finnish data where we've got all these police reports in order to really try and understand what the consequences of workplace violence are for victims and for perpetrators. And what we show is that you know, perpetrators of workplace violence face significantly weaker employment impacts when victims are female. Economic inequality between perpetrators and victims plays a substantial role in explaining that asymmetry, but it doesn't do everything. Now, this all has consequences for the kind of wider gender composition of these firms. So we see that current other employees in the firms and future employees are affected. I haven't gone into much detail about this whisper network point. We have suggestive evidence that some of our hiring results seem to be driven by firm behavior, not by applicant behavior. And really, we do see that female managers are doing things differently, that they seem to be more likely to fire perpetrators of workplace violence, and that this does have a kind of mediating impact on those negative spillover effects to the wider workforce. So there are kind of a couple of points which are kind of more, I would say, you know, implications or things for future work. So when we looked at these results as our kind of research team, I mean, we were just kind of that there could be an issue with reporting of these events here. That seems reasonable on the basis of some of the results that I've shown you today. So what we've seen is that actually relatively few, or kind of fewer than we would expect, of these kind of perpetrators against female victims within firms, they don't seem to face as large employment consequences as we might expect. And that is, you know, likely going to have an impact in terms of what incentives individuals have to report these types of events. As I said, we have some of this work a little bit in terms of to what extent can we see, if you like, the shadow of so-called whisper networks operating here. I mean, I think this is something which we need much more research on. We can only do a small amount with the data that we have, but at least from what we can see, relying on informal information channels of oh, did you know that this person at this firm did X, don't apply there. That seems a pretty fragile result from at least the data from the data that we have. These don't seem to be explaining some of the wider workforce results that we have. And I think the final thing is just, if you're interested more broadly in gender equality in the workplace, you know, we have, so something I didn't show you is that actually, somewhat surprisingly, the workplaces where we see these police reports for male-female colleague violence, they actually look like pretty good workplaces if you take that out. So in the year before these assaults, we have that actually average earnings are pretty high. There's not a huge amount, you know, the average educational kind of attainment of other workers in these firms is high. So these seem like kind of good places, you know, good economic places to work. And following these assaults, what we have is that they become significantly more male. So these things are kind of creating these pressures for greater gender segregation in the workforce, and specifically pushing women out of firms which otherwise look relatively productive. So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it there. We've got a couple of minutes for any questions that people have. So please put them in the chat, and I'll kind of collect them and try and do my best to answer anything that you might have. But yeah, thank you for being here. I've just stunned everyone with all of the depressing event results. Okay, I'll give people one more minute, and then we can end there. Okay, so we've got a question about what else we can observe for race, or so great question about is there kind of like an intersectionality story in terms of is there any heterogeneity by race here? Sadly, we don't observe race in this data, so we do have an indication, and this is actually we do have an indication of language spoken, which has been used, that's more of a kind of a native migrant dimension. But yes, but sadly we can't look at that kind of heterogeneity. I think it's really important, and especially if we take some of the results from if you like, say the Volker-Rickner paper that I mentioned, where we have that, if you like, kind of exposure to harassment, at least in terms of sexual harassment, is much stronger for those in the gender minority. We might expect that something similar could be happening in terms of the kind of a racial minority. And I think that using some of this data and these links between surveys and administrative data could be really, really valuable in terms of actually kind of providing some more insight on that. Are there any mitigations that firms can put in place other than zero tolerance policies? So on the basis of the research that we're doing, I sadly can't say anything about that. There's some nice kind of work coming out in economics about, not at the moment, it's not so much about policies, but how is it that you actually might be able to change the dial on reporting a little bit. So trying to think about really creative ways that people can report, if you like, assaults and harassment at work. But if they are worried about pushback, if they are worried about some kind of backlash effect on them, measures to mitigate that. And when we put this online, I can put some of the references for that up. But what I feel like what we're trying to do here is trying to say, look, this is a really important phenomenon. It has massive impacts on victims, has massive impacts on some perpetrators, but not as much as you would expect for male perpetrators against female victims. And so actually there's been a couple of calls coming out from certain grant organizations who are actually using some of what we put here as motivating evidence for kind of calls for, we should be doing some more randomized control trials on this. We should be kind of trying to think much more creatively about how we kind of both stop these events occurring, but also how is it that we kind of prevent these negative consequences later. So I think it's a great question. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think this is the exciting thing, is that in the future, what we should be doing is kind of really thinking through about so what is it that female managers, for example, are doing differently? Is it that the information reaches them better, or they're more likely to act on particular bits of information? And some of this we were just not able to say. Anna, so about, can we link healthcare data to this? Well, a year and 3 months later, I think the answer is going to be hopefully yes in the next couple of weeks. So what we so there's what the kind of data that we have here is very, very rich, and therefore we have to be very, very respectful of people's privacy and of data security when we're, as researchers, using this type of information. And so there's quite a lengthy process that you need to go through in order to kind of justify why you need to match in different types of data to what we already have. But we've now got approval for matching in hospitalization data, but also mental health prescription data. Because in some, what I've been telling you about today is labor market outcomes. As Anna's kind of pointing out in the chat, this is we could be using some of the hospitalization data to actually have a bit more of an idea about how serious some of these assaults were, and that's definitely something that we're interested in doing. But we're also interested in using some of the health data to have a bit of a wider kind of conception of what the impacts of these assaults are. So even if you don't lose your job as a victim, do you what happens in terms of your exposure to depression? All of these things that we kind of care about as economists in terms of a more holistic measure of well-being. So great question. Okay, so Alina, how can we extrapolate these findings to other countries, especially considering that Finland's reputation is one of being a fairly equal country? So completely. So this is happening in Finland. Like, I mean, this is, so Finland. Okay, so a couple of things actually on the Finnish context. So in when we're thinking here about the labour market context, you're completely right that Finland has one of the smallest gender pay gaps. It has, I think, a pretty progressive approach to kind of women in the workplace, and nonetheless these are the kind of effects that we're finding here. So I don't know what it looks like in other countries, but I think if this is happening like this in Finland, a lot of the kind of responses that we've been getting when we've been talking to kind of wider people about this is, well, if it's happening like this in Finland, God, what is it happening in countries which are less equal, especially if you take male-female, especially if you think about the economic inequality points that kind of we brought out in terms of in countries where systematically there's bigger gaps between men and women in the workforce. Well, even these results here would suggest, if these results hold in other countries, it would suggest actually bigger asymmetries and impacts. The other thing I'll just kind of mention, because it's relevant to some of the other work that I'm doing in this space, is that when it actually comes to domestic violence and violence against women more broadly, Finland isn't actually thought of as being a particularly progressive country. So I think it was in 2015, the UN actually had a pretty strong statement criticizing the Finnish approach to how it thinks about violence against women and girls, in terms of, in the domestic violence context, actually having pretty poor provision of shelters, and also the kind of more of a focus on mediation within existing relationships, as opposed to kind of thinking about how you might exit bad matches. But that's a teaser for other work, but it's a great question. Okay, so then time trends. Sadly, we don't go up to Me Too just because of the way that the data, how we've constructed it. Definitely, we'd love to continue to thinking about prevalence over time. Something we've kind of going to be keeping an eye on as kind of more data becomes available. And then Joy's question is about kind of how do we think about internal reporting channels, and for that I'm just gonna for that question, I'll make sure that this makes it into the wider reading. There is a little bit of work now on in what circumstances are people more likely to report to whom about these types of it's both bad culture and also bad realized events. That's really important for obviously what we're doing here, because we're using these police reports as like a kind of as the events of interest. But yeah, that's not something we answer directly in this question, but there is now quite a lot of work, and actually some really nice creative work combining bits of microeconomic theory about kind of information structures and garbling, with then actually a really practical empirical tools for thinking in the workplace about how you take some of that, if you like, incentive compatible reporting mechanism stuff in theory and bring it into practice. But yeah, not for here, but yeah, I will I'll make sure I link to it. Okay, we are now out of time, but thank you so much for all the great questions and for staying online. Yeah, do get in touch if you would like to know more. And as I say, the working paper for this project is a part of the Economics Department working paper series. Okay, thank you so much.